think of beavers as verbs instead of nouns, and how do we reverberate and engage with natural processes in the water cycle and the carbon cycle, these biodiversity cycles in the face of global weirding. I believe we're all going to have to stretch our capacity to literally participate with beaver, and seeing them as a pest is, I think, an artifact of ecological illiteracy, of colonized thinking. And they're native here. Beavers have been on the North American continent for 5 million years.
Welcome to Pest Partners, Beavers as Wetland Protectors and Climate Heroes. We are so happy that you've joined us for this conversation with Dolman and Kate Lundquist from the Water Institute and the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. Dolman and Lundquist have been working to provide education and advocacy for healthy watersheds and the pivotal role that beavers can play for many years. I am Beck Mordini, the Executive Director of Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. For 10 years, Bio for Climate has been sharing the science and the stories of the power of restoring ecosystems to stabilize the climate. We are delighted to bring you this presentation in partnership with the GBH Forum Network as part of our Life Saves the Planet program. I'll start with you, Kate. Kate Lundquist co-directs the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center's Water Institute and the Bring Back the Beaver campaign. Kate is a co-founder and member of the California Beaver Policy Working Group and the California Process-Based Restoration Network, and serves as a member of the Beaver Institute's advisory board. And that's just her beaver credentials. There's much more. Dolman is a co-founder of the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, where he co-directs the Permaculture Program, Wildlands Program, and the Water Institute in Sonoma County, California. He is a wildlife biologist, permaculture designer, and watershed ecologist, and has been active in promoting the idea of bringing back the beaver in California since the late 1990s. We are truly honored to have both of you here today. That was a very short introduction. So why don't I ask you to say a little bit more about yourselves and how you got involved in this work?
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Zooming in from the West Coast, California, Sonoma County, home of the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo, and just really grateful to be here and grateful to be doing this work. I have been always interested in functioning ecosystems, having grown up a nature nerd and playing out in wild spaces my whole life, and was fortunate enough to connect with the folks at Occidental Arts Ecology Center the year they founded the organization in 1994, and have been working with Brock for the last 20 years, really just cultivating watershed literacy and supporting communities and agencies and decision makers to embrace innovative techniques for building and restoring biodiversity and restoring our watersheds. So happy to be with you all here today.
Thanks, Beck, for hosting this and all the wonderful work you all do at Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. As a self-professed Gaianist, one who really recognizes the presence of life has been creating conditions conducive for life on this planet for 3.8 billion years. And so I'm on board with your campaign about life and livability. So I am a biologist by birth, and I ultimately did my undergrad work at UC Santa Cruz in a double major of conservation biology and agroecology. So I've always been really interested in life and ecosystems, but also the nexus of human land use. So the nexus of agriculture, rangelands, forestry, urbanization, and ultimately connecting the fact that life as we know it is carbon-based, but mostly water. And so we have our Water Institute because we really recognize that the phrase water is life is for indigenous peoples all over the planet is a ubiquitous phrase for a reason, because it's true. And so we really engage a lot in the water cycle, and we've spent a lot of time working also in watershed work and stormwater management and that kind of stuff. So people may know this phrase: slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it, as a low impact development tactic to slow water down, or we often look at watersheds of basins of relations from the ridge to the river to the reef. How do we rethink and retrofit for resilience and working with human communities? So as a wildlife biologist, the most wildlife we work with are the humans. They're the wildest ones around. So we do a lot of work we call ecosystem restoration, which I would say is some of what we're doing tonight on the beaver front.
Well, that's enough to talk about just right there. But I particularly love that term restoration, how we change our stories about our relationship to the planet, our relationship to different aspects of nature, and who we are in that system. And so, yeah, thank you very much, Brock. And he very modestly didn't to make it totally clear that Slow It, Sink It, Spread It started with him and your work there. Well, let's jump right in to learning more about your work and then focusing on a few of our key issues. Particularly, I know a lot of people came because of the fires. Fire season's already started, and that is what inspired me to look at, are there other ways to deal with fire besides clear cutting? And rehydration of the land has always been a big part of Bio4Climate's message. And we have many beaver lovers among us, including Jim Laurie. We just finished a 12-week class that heavily featured beavers. And so true beaver believers here. But aside from their many ecosystem benefits, I was particularly interested because of the fire season. So we're excited to learn the full story and what's been happening in California. So I believe, Brock, you were going to start off.
Okie doke. Well, we've introduced ourselves. You're at the Occidental Ecology Center and the Water Institute. And yeah, Kate and I just want to get into this, I love this question of pest or partners. And we obviously believe that beavers are our partners. So we at OAEC started kind of pushing on the question about beavers in the latter 90s, early 2000s, but I would say in earnest, in a really big way, probably in 2009, 2012, we really focused on beavers. And so our Bring Back the Beaver campaign, it's California-centric with respect to the campaign, although we do collaborate with a number of other folks in other states, and actually, as was mentioned on Kate's bio, and others in a national beaver working group. But primarily, we're focused on education and outreach, education about beavers, a lot of what tonight's about. There's some citizen science opportunities that we can mention, a whole bunch of interest around various research that other folks are doing about beavers and the benefits of beavers, and then also demonstration around that. And we'll talk more a little bit about non-lethal coexistence strategies. And then we'll hear more, and Kate will take the lead on this, around policy work, and especially in California, because part of our need in California with the beaver work was really addressing some outdated policies from the past decades, when it was maybe more of a less friendly beaver climate than it is now. For what it's worth, just thinking about it, there are two beavers that are native to the planet at this point in time. There's the North American beaver, Castor canadensis, and the map here on the right is roughly showing its range at time of contact. And then there's also the Eurasian beaver, Castor fiber, which we're not focusing on tonight, but that's a super interesting species. They're very similar in their behavior and things, although they are different species. What is interesting to note and think about in this estimate from Nyman's paper in '98 is the idea that there were somewhere between 60 to 400 million beavers across where the green is in this map, from the upper parts of Canada all the way down and even into parts of northern Mexico there and Baja and such. And there's estimates, and we've heard it said, that maybe within that green zone, depending on where you're at, up to 10% of the surface area could have been under what would be called beaver water, or beaver influenced habitats, wetlands and riparian corridors and places influenced by beavers. And clearly with the significant fur trapping that happened across their range, primarily starting actually up here in the Northeast and across, and then also in California, we got Russian trappers and actually Boston sea captains, since it's GBH, who were trading along the Pacific coast and heading off either to China or Russia in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So the beaver trapping hit really hard, and the loss of beavers and the impact to the hydrologic integrity of our continent, I think, has been significantly compromised. And that relates with some respects of, I know there's a lot of conversation we have about fire and water. There are some fun and interesting heroic efforts that happened out into the West, in the western part of the US, where on the left, actually, and if you haven't gone to YouTube and put in, just search the words Idaho parachute beaver, and you will pop up a little 10, 12-minute black and white film from 1948 of this program in Idaho, where they actually created these special boxes that would open up on impact and had the parachutes and put beavers in planes and use that to reintroduce beavers, because they at that point had really recognized that the impact of the loss of beavers from the trapping periods has so many detrimental impacts. And in fact, California, as you can see on the right there, took a little bit of that inspiration from Idaho and had its own translocation beaver relocation program throughout the state. And most of those beavers were translocated with horses and maybe cars in the day, but we did actually parachute beavers. And what we love about this poster here is ultimately down at the bottom, they really talk about the idea that the beaver dams in the mountains save the water for fish, wildlife, and agriculture. And I think we'll hear more about, it's not just the mountains in our areas, it's in our foothills, it's in the valley bottoms, it's in the coastal areas where the salmon are. And so we like those historic maps a lot. One of the interesting things is that, beavers are semi-aquatic rodents. And I think people know a lot about when they have a large lake that doesn't need to be dammed, or maybe just a little bit of damming, they'll have the classic lodge, like the one you can see on the right. That's the big pile of sticks that's got the underwater entrance, and inside there's the dry, cozy little place for the whole family to hang out. But in many of our areas as well, there's in river systems where maybe the beavers need a little bit more depth than the classic capacity for beavers to build dams, one of their great behaviors, and impound that water because they need greater water depth and water quantity. They want to avoid being eaten by predators. We have a mountain lion in the center of this picture. Mountain lions, especially in the West, are beaver specialists. They really prey on them, but wolves and bear and coyotes and other animals, if they can get a hold of a beaver, will eat them. So being able to have impounded water for escape cover, to backwater a bank burrow instead of the stick lodge type burrow. Same beaver species, bank burrowing beavers, lodge building beavers. They're not different. They're just different ecosystem types. And also beavers they're farmers. They're all vegetarian, and they're using that water to irrigate the land, to irrigate those riparian riverine systems, the willows or the aspens or the other cottonwood trees that they love to eat. And so they're irrigators, they're forest farmers, they're loggers, they're engineers, they're masons, they're doing all these amazing things. And that really leads to this idea of beavers as a keystone species. And if you think of the metaphor of a stonemason who's building an arch, and there's the stone that holds up the arch in the center, the keystone, and if you pull it out, the arch collapses. And that's really in the conservation biology space, this idea of beaver or wolves and grizzly bears and orca and salmon. There's a number of keystone species who their presence and the good work they do in the habitat disproportionately benefits the carrying capacity for biodiversity much beyond simply just what they need for themselves. And in the West, this is a really significant issue. We at OAEC work a lot on salmon recovery, specifically coho salmon, which is the fish in the upper right there, but also Western pond turtles and willow flycatchers and different species of frogs like this Cascades frogs, or out in the sagebrush sea area, we have sage grouse. And there's a whole host of species that are currently imperiled that the benefits of beavers have been shown to disproportionately improve the habitat and support the recovery of these species and many other species besides simply endangered species. So on the flood and fire piece of the puzzle, if you will. Beavers, beaver dams, beaver wetlands, these systems, when we have too much water, they can act like shock absorbers and help slow the flow, slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it. Beavers are the original critter that does that work. And then when in a fire space, and I think we've really witnessed this out in the Western US, in Idaho, the central image here from Dr. Joe Wheaton. There's also the little image in the lower right there in California, where you can see both areas were significantly burned out. But then there's these little green emerald islands of wet moisture that didn't burn. And in some ways, maybe it's a little bit of a fire break, but it also absolutely provided a refugia for other wildlife to be able to go and hide out and escape the catastrophic fire at the landscape level of the uplands. And Dr. Emily Fairfax and her paper referenced here, Smokey the Beaver, back in 2020 with Whittle, is really a wonderful paper that we would recommend everybody have a look at, where she looked at Google Earth maps of pre and post burns in areas where she knew there were beaver, and really looked at the benefits and the retention of areas that stayed wet and green post fire. The other fun part about beavers is that they're wetlands, those carbon-rich soils, the wetland habitats. As we know, wetlands are filters, so that the trapping of nutrients, the retention of sediment, the cleaning of water, the recharging of groundwater, the sequestration of carbon are all things that are known and well documented, that beaver wetland complexes, the associated dam, the pond, the canals, the wetlands that are often at the beginning of the pond where the deposition happens, are all an integrated part of a holistic ecosystem that beaver create. And there was a fun study in Lake Tahoe that acknowledged or documented the reduction in phosphorus to Lake Tahoe because of the presence of beavers. And if people know about Lake Tahoe, it used to be very clear, but it has been getting cloudier with eutrophication because of human land use and pollution. And so we think that we support the folks that keep Tahoe blue, because we think that beavers help keep Tahoe blue as well. Some other interesting work out of California is that dams aren't really the whole story necessarily. And then in bigger river systems or bigger lake systems where the beavers don't need to necessarily dam it up, they still have those bank burrows and the entrances to those bank burrows. And also when they go have dinner or lunch or breakfast, they chew the cambium and the bark off the trees that they're cutting down, the limbs and the twigs. And they often, those materials build up as a cache of sticks out on the bottom of the riverbed or the lake bed out in front of their house. And these researchers basically referred to those as river reefs, and they support incredible biodiversity, such as all these species in the photo. This study came out of the Smith River, which is in northwestern California, incredible river. And then also folks that were working, and specifically Carol Evans, who was at the Bureau of Land Management in Nevada, outside of Carlin, Nevada, looking at Susie Creek. And so you can see Susie Creek in 1992. It's very deeply incised, dehydrated. It had been significantly overgrazed, especially in the hot season. The cows were overgrazing it. They made a land management change to remove the grazing pressure during the hot season, and that allowed vegetation to start growing back in, especially willows, which brought the beavers back by 99. And then this image shows 2012 with beaver ponds and a wetted corridor that's now filling in and holding sediment and re-aggrading and irrigating the adjacent drylands. And there's a wonderful video about this that's just a couple years old. So an amazing multi-decadal story of beavers rehydrating and re-wetting these dryland systems in Nevada. And so incision for us is a big deal. And so we really step up to the fight to fight incision with incisors by letting our beavers sink their teeth into the issue.
Wonderful. Thanks all. And thank you, Brock. So yes, here we are. All of those benefits that beaver provide, and yet how are our states doing with that? Are they recognizing the benefits? Are they recognizing their conservation value? So in California, they had not been for years and years, and it literally has taken Brock and me 20 years now to build the relationships, to develop and share the resources, and to really support the changes that have recently come in our state here in California. And honestly, it took some retirements as well. And so in June 2022, our California legislature passed the governor's budget, which included the creation of a new California Department of Fish and Wildlife-led Beaver Restoration Program, which is amazing. First time we've had that ever in the state, and so super excited. And we've now got 5 permanent staff that are working on human beaver coexistence and developing a beaver management plan and conducting the first ever translocations for restoration and doing outreach and education. And also along with that, in response to a petition we filed in 2019, the guidelines that determine what landowners can do if they are having conflicts with beaver finally have been changed. And so now landowners are being asked to exhaust coexistence techniques first before being granted permission to kill beaver that they are having conflict with. So that's a huge win for us, and we're really excited. And as I said, for the first time in nearly 75 years, beaver are being released on the landscape back again in California in places where they have been trapped out. And we were very honored that our partners with the Maidu Summit Consortium that we've been working with since 2015 were selected to participate in this historic translocation, as were our partners at the Tule River Tribe as well. And they are getting their beavers this summer. And so it's an exciting moment. We're having some incredible land back moments happening with both of these tribal entities in conjunction also with these beaver back moments. And it's a huge time for us in California. And we're really grateful that this is happening, because in some cases, it's not always possible to just expect beaver to return on their own. Sometimes they need assistance. And so that is what is happening here. And we even have proposal forms. So if you are actually zooming in from California, you should fill out a form if you have a project you're interested in proposing to the state about relocating beaver. And also in our state, some important funding was granted to us actually to help create this beaver coexistence training and support program in partnership with the Beaver Institute and their Beaver Corps program, which is really exciting. So we're going to have a whole system to support landowners in having both technical and financial assistance in carrying out these coexistence methods that are so important to living with beaver. Also, we introduced a beaver bill in California that basically makes this beaver program permanent so that it can't be taken away by the next governor that's elected, and it codifies it into the legislature. And so far it's going really well, and we have been cruising through. The assembly approved it unanimously, and we're going on to the next steps and really looking forward to passing this. Beaver restoration is a holistic approach that includes a variety of actions, and we really are excited to continue helping people understand this. A lot of folks get super excited about the relocation piece, and yet there are all these different parts to beaver restoration that are equally important. And so coexistence, really taking care of the beaver that we have first, is always the best step first if we can. We don't want to de-beaver areas if we don't have to. We want them to be able to do the benefits that, contribute the benefits that they do, and also mitigate any potential damage. So there are lots of different techniques, whether it's putting flexible pond levelers through dams to reduce flooding, or fencing off culverts like you see in the lower left there to prevent them from blocking them. Lots of vegetation issues. It's easily remedied with wrapping, electrical fencing. There are a bunch of different strategies for protecting valuable vegetation. And a new device that we discovered, our National Wildlife Refuge partners developed for their concrete weirs that they use to convey water from one wetland to another wetland, are often blocked by beavers. In fact, daily blocked, and a lot of labor is going into keeping those clear. And so this beaver backsaver device that they developed is working just fantastically. And so we're getting the word out about that strategy as well. And then in places where we have beaver and there is space, but maybe their dams are blowing out or they just aren't persisting as long as we would like them, we can actually increase the resiliency of their complexes and the duration by literally reinforcing their dams is one of the techniques that we use. We can also give them more space, like this example near the state capitol in California, Doty Ravine, where they had the space, they took down the levees so that the beavers could access more of it. It had been a small, narrow creek that was not always running very well, and they wanted to restore it. And so they stopped killing the beaver first. They opened up the space, they started reinforcing their dams, and then they started mimicking the dams in between and adding more structures. And the beaver, with just that input from the humans over 3 to 4 years for less than $75,000, were able to expand the wetland by 1,200%. The mimicry and relocation is yet another technique that we use a lot. And so again, in places where we have beaver already, we can mimic and expand and help them get a better grasp on the area and have greater effect. And in places where they haven't returned yet, or maybe they aren't suitable to return, we can mimic them as well. And so these are pictures of folks in California building certain forms of in-stream structures, also called beaver dam analogs. These happen to be postless beaver dam analogs, many different ways to mimic beavers, and these structures help hold the water back, similar to what beaver dams do. And then ultimately, if you have a place that really you want to return beaver to, this is a great way to pre-beaver or prepare a site for their return. And with that, I'm going to stop because I'm sure we've got lots of questions and we can just start having the conversation live and see what you all are interested in hearing more about.
Thank you so much, Brock and Kate. So one of the first questions is a little bit foundational, and somebody had asked about moving non-native beavers to areas where they might be native or more useful. And so there was a little bit of confusion on, are beavers native? And I understand that there was some confusion about that in California officially as well. And maybe if you just want to say a couple words about that.
I'm happy to jump in. So yeah, beaver are native to all of North America, and there has not been enough genetic work to even determine all of the subspecies that were named long ago in the early 1900s have not been recognized by the international taxonomic community. And so this whole concept somehow got adopted in California because the scientists that were doing work in California early on in the early 1900s were interviewing trappers and whatnot to find out where beaver occurred historically, and got a very narrow perception because by that point there were hardly any beaver left. The trappers thought that they were only up in the Klamath River Basin, in the Colorado River, and in the Central Valley, and then therefore determined that they were not native to anywhere else in California, including the entire coast and the Sierra Nevada above 1,000 feet. And so we did a bunch of historic ecology work to find evidence to the contrary, and successfully were able to aggregate all of this physical evidence, buried beaver dams, carbon dated pre-contact, and tons of historic accounts and tons of ethnographic accounts as well, 60 names for beaver in native California languages. And so it's not so much an issue. The things most people think about actually in North America when moving beaver around are just making sure that they're quarantined and that they don't have diseases that they don't want to introduce into new watersheds. But other than that, it's a common practice to move beaver around.
Well, and that is an interesting question. Before we got on, I said, I have in my mind this picture of places that have too many beavers where they're considered pests, and we can just crate them all up and take them to places where we need them. What are some of the challenges and realities around that kind of thinking?
I mean, if you think back to the image that Kate showed of the spot called Doty Ravine, so here was a place where there were beavers that are native beavers there, but the folks at the time didn't really believe they were so native or didn't really understand them and thought they shouldn't be there, and they were actually killing beavers. And it was once they partnered with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for restoration that the Fish and Wildlife folks said, well, we're not really going to work with you unless you guys stop killing beavers and we actually work with the beavers. So the idea that so then working with the beavers and everything Kate spoke about there allowed them to basically get that massive increase in wetland area and all those beneficial functions by keeping the beavers where they were and helping the beavers be better beavers where they are. So our first and foremost is, just because you might be annoyed with them, all those coexistence strategies and tactics and techniques to figure out how to live with the beavers you've got and see the blessing of the beaver benefit package where you are and employ coexistence tactics is first and foremost what is needed. And if you, to the best extent practicable, you've literally exhausted all of those efforts and you still can't figure out how to live with the beavers and they must go, then you move into the relocation question. But that still then means relocate to where? And where is the beaver going to go? Are there already beavers there? Is that habitat ready for beavers? There's a whole process of assessing the food, the water, the cover, the shelter, the viability of the habitat. And to be honest with you, even in the best case scenario, survivability of beaver translocations isn't, it's 50% at times, 40 to 60% at times. So it's not a foregone conclusion. And so the let's just export our beavers as an easy way out, I think, doesn't really, shall we say, hold water.
Well, I appreciate the reality of that, and not so much as solving the pest issue, but as trying to rehydrate areas that are in such desperate need, right? And I think it's very important to be aware of what are the needs of beavers. You can't just plop them down anywhere and hope that they'll survive. I've also heard they need to be transported as families. They mate for life. I mean, you want to be aware of those things. I saw you shared a story where the willow had to come back first, right? Because they need food and materials. So we've heard a little bit about renegade beaver activities, particularly in Europe, and it sounds really exciting. We want to get our hands wet, right? We want to be in action, but you really have to know what you're doing. And I imagine too, relocation is not legal in many states in the US. Is that true? And why is that? Probably.
That is true. Yeah, not all states allow relocation, and it's each state has their own rationales. And some states, have different guidelines around relocation. California has always, California relocated more beaver than any state back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and yet then they stopped doing that. And so it has taken a great effort to get them to re-embrace that technique and practice. It's not appropriate everywhere to relocate beavers. There aren't, like you were saying, not all sites are, you need to have good habitat for beaver and space for them to be received. And so this is why we always default to coexistence first. And I saw that there was a question about where can we get information about coexistence and practitioners, and we definitely reach out to the Beaver Institute, which is a national organization that trains through their Beaver Core program practitioners to install the different coexistence devices. And they have great information about that. And they have a whole listing of practitioners by state. Brock, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I didn't, but I guess I wanted to kind of pick up on Beck's piece a little bit since I didn't address it. But the question around aridity, and if your agenda is that you are in a watershed that for whatever reasons has been impacted hydrologically and is experiencing human-induced drought-like conditions, like maybe loss of stream flow and dewatering of groundwater recharge or water quality effects, there's lots of studies, especially out in the West, that have documented. And that was kind of the point of that little series we showed in Carlin, Nevada there just over the period of time. And that's Carlin, Nevada is 5,000 feet above sea level and gets less than 6 inches of rain a year. And the presence of beavers showed up in a dewatered, incised, dehydrated, desertified system. And within a decade, slowed it, spread it, and sink it, stored it, and shared it, re-wetted it, re-greened it. And the native trout were able to recover and return. The frogs, sandhill cranes were able to be there. And the cattle grazers, and that's what's really cool about many ranchers out in the West, and in that specific system as well, the ranchers there are basically like 20 years ago, we shot beavers. And now if we didn't have beavers during the drought, we'd be out of business because there'd be no water and we would have to sell our cows. So the re-wetting, re-perennialization of streams that may have gone dry or intermittent, and the associated groundwater recharge is a big topic, but absolutely shallow groundwater, hyporheic groundwater, lateral connectivity, subsurface irrigation of vegetation into the legacy floodplains that used to be connected before the system in size when the beavers were taken out is all part of the portfolio of beaver benefits.
Wonderful. And I understand there was an example where the beaver showed up on their own. They weren't even relocated in some of these instances. Is that correct?
Yeah, and in some areas, if you've got an extant population somewhere in the system and they can move up or downstream, or and in some cases beaver will even walk overland. We had that in Sonoma County. There's a little creek called Sonoma Creek, and the Russian River, where the Occidental Ecology Center is, had beaver as late as maybe the 1870s or 80s, and then they were gone. And then back in 2010, they showed up in a reservoir in the Russian River, and they had walked out of one creek. They actually went through a community with their golf course, and they staged in the golf ponds, chewed down some willows next to the golf pond, which the golf course manager liked because it was shading the putting green. So he was happy with the beavers because he couldn't got permission to cut the willow down. And then it walked overland, and they reintroduced themselves 130 years later. They rewilded themselves, and now they're beginning to show up in many other tributaries of the Russian River.
Wonderful. People have asked about, evidence of bringing beavers back and rehydrating in different geological areas. I think we pretty much covered that in this discussion. If someone still has additional questions, please re-put that if you don't think we've covered that. So beavers, we have a question. If you have seen where beavers are, you're not talking about a wildland area, maybe an urban interface area, and their chewing looks very destructive. And we've seen some questions come in ahead of time with how do you deal with that damage? Is it dangerous? It looks really destructive. What are both sides of that story? Are you going to lose your whole forest in order to have the beavers? What can you tell people about that?
So beavers are a force of change. They create dynamism in the riparian systems that they live in. And this, back in the era when we had thriving large wetlands where there was a lot of space and a lot of vegetation, those wetlands co-evolved with the beaver and could withstand that kind of disturbance. And so depending on where you are, it will really dictate what the response is to beavers creating that level of disturbance. They need to cut trees both to keep their teeth sharp and to also have bark to eat and materials to build with. And so this is just part of what you get with beaver. And some places have more capacity to support that activity in a beaver. And it's a lot of the tree species that beavers prefer tend to be deciduous trees that coppice, stump sprout when they're chewed. And so it isn't always destructive. It depends on the species. And so, in places where they are favoring those trees, a lot of them are just going to grow back. And beavers were the original coppicers, and they were the ones that the indigenous people really appreciated because they made great basket material that would sprout up in these nice straight stems. And so, again, it's a really site-specific question to that, answer to that question. And so if you've just got this one little narrow strip of trees that the beavers are working on, you might want to protect at least some of them and decide which ones that you can donate to the beaver and let them coppice, ideally ones that will stump sprout.
The landscapes that we all inhabit have been so radically modified and altered, and beavers have been the least of that issue. I think we all need to look in the mirror. And so when we're looking at these human Western settler colonist modified landscapes and getting precious about specific little bits and pieces of ecosystem, as Kate said, there's a whole bunch of opportunities to if you've got really critical trees in the last large specimen tree in your riparian corridor, by all means, fencing trees out to mitigate beaver chewing damage and retain that tree is important and is critical to do. But I think part of nature-based solutions as we move forward and think of beavers as verbs instead of nouns, and how do we reverberate and engage with natural processes in the water cycle and the carbon cycle, these biodiversity cycles in the face of global weirding. I believe we're all going to have to stretch our capacity to literally participate with beaver and seeing them as a pest is, I think, an artifact of ecological illiteracy, of colonized thinking. And they're native here. Beavers have been on the North American continent for 5 million years. And they're here and they do really good things. The beaver benefit package, the beaver glass is way more than half full with benefits versus half empty with nuisances. And there are some nuisances and we can learn to live with them. And I think our grandkids will thank us when we sort that out across state by state. And I see a lot of questions about people frustrated in Massachusetts with, beavers. Humans put roads in and we put culverts and we put bridges and we do all this infrastructure and all these pipes. We have a pipe dream, and when beavers show up, it becomes a pipe nightmare. And again, blaming the beaver for this ill-designed human infrastructure, I think is a little bit of victim blaming, I would say. And we can manage that and we can deal with it as best as possible. And some infrastructure needs a redesign while we're also implementing coexistence structures. For those folks in Massachusetts, I saw one question. Mike Callahan and the Beaver Institute, Beaver Solutions, are from Massachusetts and have done thousands of non-lethal coexistence devices in your state. They work throughout the Eastern Seaboard, and they're the first people that you should go check their website out and give a ring if you're experiencing these issues. And I'm not belittling the fact that when a beaver plugs up the culvert and floods your road out or your house, that's a big deal. I'm not diminishing that, but yeah, how do we begin to redesign for collaboration, or I think really honoring that cooperation and symbiosis is really the root of the biodiversity and cooperation versus competition. And I know that I see Kristen Olson is on this tonight, and I will just give her wonderful book, Sweet in Tooth and Claw, a plug, which I really appreciate, and honoring the symbiogenesis, if you will, of the amazing work of a number of folks that really acknowledge how do we move towards a convivial collaborative space versus a competitive and space.
Well, and that is a restoration. I really love how you put that. All the nature-based solutions are going to require us to give up the idea that all of this land is ours, right? And when we talk about wetland restoration, it's giving back land that we have filled in, that we've taken away from the ecosystem. And yeah, part of that, what looks like beaver destruction to us, is really giving back and restoring a habitat that needs to be there. And as you said, the beaver deceiver, there are a lot of coexistence strategies for that. So we only have 15 minutes left, and there is a great question here that I really would like us to at least start this conversation, if not have to finish it offline. So as we said, in many states, relocation is illegal. You're basically required to kill a beaver if you are trying to get rid of it as considering it a pest. What does it take to do what you've done in California? How do you move the needle? What was the basic? It took a lot of time, but now that maybe we're in a different place in this conversation, understanding, what do you recommend people who want to be activists or who are activists in their states do?
So we've had a very clear strategy from the start of starting by really just determining what our goals were. And for us, it was really having beaver be recognized for their conservation value and be managed as such, since literally our laws didn't protect beaver. They're still not protected, but they didn't even acknowledge their value, and really focused on how you could trap them for recreation and for commercial fur, and how you could kill them if they were causing you grief. So it took us looking at, all right, let's do a power map. Who is it that we need to get over to our side to understand the importance of conserving beaver, of valuing them, of protecting them, of making sure that we're not just killing them willy-nilly without considering the impacts on our watersheds. And so in that power mapping process in the beginning, really our biggest, obstacle, or our biggest, the people that we needed to get to say yes to come over and believe, and understand the science behind what it was we were talking about, what was our California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then other agencies as well. There were concerns around fish passage. There were concerns around, are they native or are they not native? So all of these different obstacles emerged through this brainstorming process and in talking to people and resources and whatnot. And so from there, we were able to develop our strategy, which is we need to conduct more outreach and education. We need to bring the scientific community to the table and share their results that have already been proven across the United States and elsewhere, and really start bringing the conversation to the table and enlisting those who could benefit from beaver restoration. It turns out beaver can be really beneficial to salmon restoration. They can be really beneficial to making our working landscapes more, have forage longer into the dry season and whatnot. And so really enlisting those whose their own mandates could actually benefit from restoring beaver as well, and building coalitions, and really just slowly but surely continuing to identify, who are the people that we need to get to say yes, and what is it going to take to get them to say yes. And so that's the strategy that we've been working for the last 20 years, and we've had incremental successes, and the salmon community finally got it. It took several years, but they're now doing their own research and their own demonstrations of beaver restoration and how they're protecting salmon for them and providing critical habitat. And so that's really helped add to the body of evidence, and to really help broaden the support as well. Brock, what would you add to that?
No, I think you covered the gist of it. It really is, it's community organizing, it's outreach, it's education, and again, that was outreach, education, research, demonstration, policy work, and it's a multi-pronged approach because we're taking on a whole systems approach, which is kind of how we bring that work from our work in permaculture design and whole systems regenerative design, is you really got to engage at every scale. And because I see a lot of questions here of the magnitude of the level of settlement patterns and the issues with beavers. The thing is when we trapped out beavers out of that 10% of beaver water, though the reason is, besides the fur, was that those soils, once you drain those beaver wetlands, that's where the big, black, rich, carbon-laden, super ag soils. And then we love to move into wetlands in that flat floodplain area. And so we killed the beavers, and so many human settlements and agriculture and urban areas are living in areas that were historically beaver habitat. And beavers are now trying to reclaim some of that beaver back habitat again. And that's and so I think it is an opportunity for a fundamental rethink about our relationship of how human settlement patterns intervene and intersect in more of a collaborative way as we move forward in a resilience framework. And that's, fire is asking us humans to do that, drought is asking us to do that, flood is asking us to do that, various disease issues are asking us to do that, biodiversity crisis is asking us to do that. And beaver are just waving their little flat tail and saying, hey, we're here to help for our part of it, which is a really critical part of any watershed, maybe 10 to 20% maximum. The other 80%, 80% of the surface area of a watershed has never been beaver habitat and isn't going to be beaver habitat. And we've all got to step up to the uplands in a whole other way. But that's a topic for another show.
Another show. So I do want to circle back to fire and any additional information or insight. You talked a little bit about fire refugia. What is that? how much evidence are we seeing of it? I know we did direct people to Emily Fairfax's website where there's a lot of great pictures. She's been collecting this data for some time. But what would you like to add to that? And particularly, where could that make an impact in California? Has that been part of your conversation?
So Dr. Emily Fairfax's work, she used remote sensing to look at fire footprints and see where the areas that hadn't burned, if they were in fact beaver complexes, and in some cases they were. And there is actual video evidence of right after fires. For example, there's a bear swimming in the beaver complex, and that is clearly an indication that the bear survived the catastrophic fire and was not burned. And so it's for us in California, because we have such a legacy, not only have we drained our wetlands, stole them from the beaver, and then killed off, attempted to kill off our indigenous land managers. Thankfully, we did not. That has created this whole scenario where we have just so many increased fuels, and we're now faced with a problem that we've inherited for decades of lack of using good fire to manage our forests. And so in places where we are trying to restore those forests and reduce the fuel loads, having wetlands interspersed as much as possible where it makes sense, where there's water, where there's space, where there is habitat that can support beaver, then it makes sense to have beaver there. And that is definitely something that we've been looking at. That's something that our partners are looking at, and the department as well, because again, we need enough habitat to support the beaver in the first place. And, we're definitely looking at large landscape scale. And I understand, those of you that are in smaller urban environments where there isn't a lot of wildlands left, beaver can still provide benefits. It's not, they're not necessarily going to save the city from a city fire. However, they can, again, if they are given the space and have the access to materials and flow to create a greater wetland system within an urban environment, then that's going to help provide better habitat for all of the species should there be these climate impacts that are going to be detrimental to our urban centers.
Well, thank you for that. And I think that is a realistic view. None of the work we have to do is easy, right? And none of it's going to be instant. And so there's certainly value in those fire refugia, but it would be a stretch to say that beavers are going to stop the fires or, have that huge impact immediately. But we have to start somewhere, right? And so I think that's very important. And beavers are not the only rehydration nature-based solution. And somebody did ask a very good question about, who was aware of managed grazing techniques and bringing back other infiltration species. And so there are a lot of, there's, as Brock says, that whole big picture of the ecosystem. And beavers are a key player, but they're not the only one, and they don't need to do it alone. Let's see what we need to wrap up with in about 5 minutes. Did we get a link to BeaverCon? And do you want to say a little bit about what BeaverCon is? This is the beginning of a conversation. There's a growing community, and let's hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so this is a conference about beavers that BeaverCon that will be in Boulder, Colorado, coming up in the end of October. And it's a national conference. It will be international. Very likely there'll be folks from that deal with castor fiber, the Eurasian beaver over in the UK or other countries and nations in Europe and such. And it's a wonderful gathering. It's been on the East Coast before, and now they're trying to flip-flop back and forth in different regions of the country. And so if you are interested and want to meet the whole world of activated beaver believers in the US that are doing incredible work in states from the East Coast and South and across the Midwest and all the Western states, especially, BeaverCon is, hurry up, sign up, get your tickets. It's going to be a wonderful event. There's also been a State of the Beaver Conference that's happened in Oregon for many years. And yeah, if people have not read the book Eager by Ben Goldfarb or Beaverland by Lila Phillips, those two books right now I think will also fire people's information and imagination, and expand on some of the things we've also been talking about today.
That would be a great place to wrap up, but a question occurred to me, and I would like to hear a little bit more about your partnership and relationship with the indigenous tribes. How that came about, how a little bit more detail on that.
I could start. OAEC has a long history of working with the tribal community in our area in Sonoma County, which is known as the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria. And I think through that effort, built a lot of trust and connection, and I think that those words travel widely through other indigenous communities and in different ways. And so tribal citizens from two different tribe and tribal groups separately reached out to Kate and I back in 2015, 2018 about their interest in rewilding, bringing back beaver, or beaver back, if you like land back, beaver back to their homelands. And so it's always working with tribal communities at their invitation, and basically it moves at the pace of trust. And we spent many years building trust and deep relationship and supporting them. And Kate showed the image of the beaver return that happened with the Department of Fish and Wildlife last fall in a beautiful valley called Tasman Koyom with the Maidu Summit Consortium. Folks can look them up. And then Kate could probably speak to the fact that she just got to attend another beaverback event just last week with Tule River Tribe.
Yeah, it's been an amazing privilege to get to work with these tribal entities and to have this collaboration and to support them in what they want help with and to witness their integration of this Western scientific-based beaver restoration science with their traditional ecological knowledge. And it's been a really fruitful collaboration, and we feel really grateful and privileged to have the opportunity to get to collaborate in that way.
It sounds very special. It sounds wonderful. Well, any last words from either of you? We have a couple minutes left.
I was just going to say, I put in the chat there a link that the Maidu Summit Consortium folks had. We collaborated with them and helped write up a beaver recruitment strategy in collaboration with them that resulted in that rewilding of beaver with the department. And so by all means, if folks want a little bit of a deeper dive around kind of what are the components of, is this a play, what do beaver need? What is the assessment? What are we looking for? How do we evaluate the viability of a location and the suitability? I think that recruitment strategy is an interesting a document to have a look at that was done explicitly on behalf of the Mountain Maidu peoples.
Great. And Kate?
Just thanks everyone for your interest. And, beavers are a keystone species that work with lots of other species. And so we too like to work with folks that are working in many different spaces, and welcome your reaching out and just, collaboration. And definitely check out the Beaver Institute and all of the national work that they're doing. They have national working groups. They have a national help desk, so you can just submit your questions there, and stay tuned for lots more exciting collaborations.
I appreciate everyone who joined on today for spending a little bit of time on this Thursday night with us and dropping into this conversation, and hopefully ultimately not just beaver, but I really wanted to acknowledge the biodiversity for a livable climate, and how do we as humans really get back in right relation with all of our other relatives, more than human relatives of all species, and so happy to chat about beavers specifically, but thank you for hosting this broader conversation, because I know you all do so much good work in so many other venues as well.
Well, thank you, Brock. We are very honored to have both of you here and to lead this discussion and to share with us, not only the possibility, but the journey and what's really been happening on the ground. It's a rare privilege, and appreciate the decades of work that you've done in this field with beavers and with water in general, and really helping to change and shift that conversation to restore all of us. Thank you to the GBH Forum Network, another great talk that we are happy to host in partnership with them. So thank you very much. This is the beginning of a conversation, the beginning, 20 years in for you, but the beginning of this conversation and partner for us to keep moving forward. Everyone have a wonderful evening or wherever you are, and we'll keep on Beaverback. Thank you.